Starting a cross stitch project doesn't have to mean starting in the middle. In this video, I'll show you how to confidently start from the top, bottom, sides, or anywhere you want without any fear of running out of fabric. Hey everyone, I'm Jackie from Adam Hart Cross Stitch. And if you're trying to work out how exactly you can start from the top or the middle or the bottom of your cross stitch project, we're going to cover it all right here in this video. Just recently, I posted a video talking about how to calculate the amount of fabric you need for your cross stitch project, and the amount of comments I received from people saying that they just like to guess and cross their fingers really blew me away. Now, if that's your style of doing it, truly no shade, but it really got me thinking about how to pick a starting point for your projects. Now, if you are just guesstimating how much fabric you need for any project, and then you're starting from the middle, I could see that probably working out most of the time. I hope. For me personally, usually, I really prefer actually starting from the top and then working my way down. And I've gotten a lot of questions asking about how to start from anywhere other than the middle. So I figured this would be a great time to break it down and walk through it together. So I think the way most of us are taught is to start from the middle, and that works well for a couple of different reasons. The first and most obvious is it's really going to ensure that your design is nice and perfectly centered on your fabric. Now, that's really nice for finishing at the end of the project, but if you are in a scenario where your fabric margins are really tight, it's also the best way to ensure you're not going to run out of space anywhere. And since most patterns are going to give you lines to show you exactly where that center stitch is, you always have like a really nice reference point when looking at your patterns to figure out where you need to start from. So when it comes to starting in the middle of my fabric, what I like to do is fold my fabric in half twice, just like that. And now I know this little point here is very close to the center point of my fabric, and that's where I want my starting stitch to be. Now, my favorite way to keep track of that point is to iron it, really just a press. And then when you fold it open, you've got this really nice, sharp center line running through. So that's how I like to do it. For some folks, they really don't want to deal with any extra creasing in their fabric. So they don't want to iron those lines in. So you could just, when you have it folded over, just do a quick kind of finger press just at the center point, and that should give you enough of a mark to be able to see it. You could also place a tiny dot here with a pencil. I only like to place that on the back side of my fabric. Some folks also will just kind of pop their needle right in. And then when you unfold it, you'll have your needle right there. And again, it would only stay in for, a couple of minutes until you make your initial stitches. If you don't want to use a needle, you could also just kind of throw in a quick, just little piece of thread right there. And again, when you unfold it, it will be right there. However, you do it, you just really want to have on your fabric your reference point for the center stitch. Once we have that, we're then going to go to our pattern. And what we want to look for on our pattern, it's not these grid lines here, but there will always be some indication of the center. Here we have both an arrow and red lines. Sometimes it's one or the other. Sometimes it's even like a really thick line, but we just want to follow that to where it meets the center. So this is a multi-page pattern. So you might have to lay a few pages out. Here on page 1, I have the horizontal line. Page 2, I can see the vertical line, and those are going to intersect right here. Also, I don't know why it printed out with this, just ignore it. But now when I go to my pattern, I can see where the center stitch is. And so that is the stitch I want to place in the center of my fabric. Now, before you place a stitch, you want to remember that you have your fabric in the right orientation. So let's say my pattern were, wider than it is tall, whichever it is, you just want to make sure you have your fabric facing the right way. Once you kind of get your initial set of stitches in, it's pretty easy to tell what the orientation of your design is. But sometimes it's nice to just mark the top orientation of your fabric. You can place like a little basting stitch up here with a pencil. You could also just like draw a really faint line, just if you're worried about getting confused which way's up and which way is the side. But once you know you have your fabric oriented in the same position, you have your center point marked. If you're stitching in a hoop or anything, you get it placed where you're stitching. And then again, just come back to your pattern and you've got a great reference point to start with. And, for this symbol, I don't always start dead center. You can count up, count down, count to the side, and then again, just move out from your center point on your fabric appropriately. Now, I start in the middle plenty, but my real preference is always starting from the top and then working my way down the pattern. It really just fits best with my style of stitching. For others, it might be totally a preference to start working from the bottom up. Or sometimes the way a pattern is laid out, it's just easier to start from the side. Now, any one of these starting points is totally fine and totally doable. But to do any of them successfully, ensuring that your design stays centered and that you don't run out of fabric, you will need to know what your design and fabric dimensions are. I know, there's no guesstimating here.
So, this really starts with making sure you're buying enough fabric from the start. My favorite way of doing this is using this calculator from Yarn Tree. The first thing you'll need is the stitch count from your pattern. So, you're going to input the number of stitches wide by the number of stitches high that your pattern is. From there, you're going to input the fabric count that you plan to use. And now, this one I feel like is always worded a little bit funny, but what they're asking you here is if you're stitching over one or over two squares. I'm using 18 count and I'm going to be stitching over one. Down here, it's going to ask us how much extra space we want for border and finishing. Now, the default here is 2 inches for the border, 2 inches for finishing, which is going to give you a total of 4 inches of fabric allowance around all the sides of your design. For me personally, I like a total of 3 inches of fabric allowance, and I never recommend going any smaller than 2, but we're just going to go ahead and leave it here at the default, which is 4. So then once we hit calculate size, it's going to tell us exactly how big our stitched area is going to be based on the fabric count we're using. And that's really nice because patterns won't always include that, or it might not include it for the fabric count that you're planning to use. And then here it lets us know how big our fabric needs to be. And this includes all of that extra fabric allowance we want. The really cool little bonus with this tool is it also gives you a suggestion of what size tapestry needle to use. It lets you know how many strands of floss you should be using for your full stitches and your back stitching. So again, I just really love this tool, totally free to use, and I find it so helpful. Now, if for some reason you don't want to use this free online tool, you can of course do the math yourself. You would just need to divide your stitch count by the fabric count and then add the fabric allowance. Now, a lot of times you're not going to find a piece of fabric that is the exact size you need. So I tend to purchase a piece that's a little bit larger than my dimensions, and then I cut it down to the size. And I will typically round up or round down to the nearest whole inch. So now I have a piece of fabric that is cut to the exact size I want it to, including all of the space of the fabric allowance that I wanted. Now, for full coverage charts, I love to start in the top left corner. And as long as you know how much fabric you have and how big your fabric allowance is, it's so, so easy. So I'm going to go ahead and just take a ruler and I'm going to measure 4 inches down from the top. And I'm just going to leave my finger right there.
And then I want to measure 4 inches in from the side. So I'm just going to bring my finger over a little bit. And I know that that exact point is 4 inches in from the top and from the side. So now I just like to take a needle and pop it in right there. And I know exactly where my starting stitch needs to be if I'm starting in that top corner. And I'm using a fairly small piece of fabric for an example. So I know 4 inches really seems like a lot. Of course, you can do less than this. I just don't advise going any smaller than 2 inches. And if you don't want to place a needle there, you could do a very faint, mark with a pencil, especially with a full coverage design. It's going to be covered up right away. Or you could even place a little piece of thread there, like I showed when we marked our center spot. And of course, I want to double check and just make sure that I have my fabric in the correct orientation. That's always going to be important. So now if I look at a pattern for a full coverage chart, it's really easy to find my starting point. It's going to be page 1 for me because I want to start in that top left corner. And I know that that right there is going to be my starting stitch. And then I know exactly where I'm going to place it. So, just to reiterate, I can really only do that with full confidence, knowing that I'm not going to run out of fabric when I get to the other side or the bottom, because I measured the exact size of fabric I need based on the fabric count I'm using and knowing exactly how much border space I allotted for. Sometimes the most natural starting point for a pattern isn't going to be in a corner like I just showed you, but it could be somewhere else along the top, the bottom, the sides, really just kind of depending on the actual design of the pattern. So I really think the easiest way to do this is to make sure that we have these reference points here of our horizontal and vertical lines. So this one I pressed with my iron. I know there's other creases here. I'm ignoring those and just paying attention to the ones running through the center.
Another option, if you are still trying to avoid having any of those crease marks, like from using an iron, another really popular option is to kind of baste in your vertical and horizontal lines using this sulky metallic thread. The really nice thing about this metallic thread is it's like really, really slippery, for lack of a better word. So you can stitch right over the thread. And then when you get to the very end of your project, you can just pull that sulky metallic straight out and it will like slide from right underneath your stitches.
You could do the sulky thread like what I showed, but we really want to have these lines running across from edge to edge. And then when it comes to deciding where to start on your pattern, sometimes it's really just kind of about what makes sense with the pattern. But what I want to start with is looking at either the horizontal or vertical center lines, and because, again, I really like working from the top down on my projects, I would probably start with the vertical line. And on this vertical center line, there's a stitch right there. This is the very top of the pattern. So there's nothing else above it. So this is just, again, a really nice and easy reference. So this is the stitch I'm going to start with. This stitch obviously is dead center on that line. But if you were, maybe a couple stitches over, that's fine. You would just count over however many stitches it is where you're going to be starting. So again, really easy. I have my fabric oriented in the correct position. And from my center line, I'm just going to measure down 4 inches. Again, because I know that's how much fabric allowance I allowed for. I always find it easiest to just take a needle and kind of place it in that first stitch. And then I would load this onto my hoop or Q snap And that is where I would start stitching from. And again, this same concept applies whether it's the top, the sides, the bottom. It's really all about just finding a good reference point and knowing exactly how much fabric allowance you have on all sides of your design. So while it might be a little bit more work up front, calculating exactly how much fabric you need and then cutting it down to size, it makes it so much easier later on if you're wanting to start from any point other than the middle. Now, if you're working from a kit, you might not know how much border space or fabric allowance they provided in the piece of fabric that was included in the kit. So, assuming you don't want to just start in the middle, as long as you have the stitch count in either width or height, or even better, the design size based on the fabric count, you can just measure the piece of fabric they provided and then kind of reverse engineer it from there. Especially if it's a smaller design size or piece of fabric, I just like to kind of lay my fabric out in the correct orientation. And then if I have the design size in inches, I can just kind of look at it with a ruler right there on the fabric and then just measure what's extra. And then once you know how many extra inches of fabric you have around all four sides of your design, you would just follow the same steps, measuring in from the edge of your fabric. So, if you're not a fan of starting in the middle or just wanting to try something new, I hope you now feel fully confident in tackling starting your project from the top, the bottom, or the sides. Once again, I'm Jackie from Adam Hart Cross Stitch. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you found this video helpful. If you want to help support my channel and see more content like this, please do all the good things, liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thank you again so much, and until next time, happy stitching.